I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Political Philosophy is a Maurin Academy podcast. We will learn that virtue ethics as an approach has a lot to do with character formation, and character formation has to do with our habits, what we actually do on a regular basis, and they kind of form our moral norms or moral notions. They are molded by reason, yes, but also by faith and by custom, maybe even more so, although they're all interrelated because people's customs and their faith are usually, they have some reason embedded within them, and they exist because they have worked for quite some time. Virtue ethics, as we'll discover more, vary somewhat by place and time, not completely. And by the time we get done with this 4-week course, we'll see that that there is some common thread, some commonality that ties virtue ethics together across time and space. But you'll notice that they can vary and do vary by time and place. For instance, in this picture here, we have the knight and the lady. And, back in medieval times, the knight was sort of like the manly character par excellence, right? He was what you, as if you were a man, strive to be, right? Now, a man who actually takes care of his family and does the laundry is considered a virtuous man, right? Very, very different. There is a common thread, though. Both are trying to support their society and create harmony and safety and comfort through what they do. But we can see a lot of variance. So that's a part of virtue ethics. So what I want to do tonight is, as I said, kind of place Aristotle and ancient virtue ethics in the context of intellectual history. And that means I'm going to go through 4 different really big eras: the ancient, the medieval, the early modern, and the modern era. Okay, so I'm going to take you on a trip that is necessarily going to be way too short. We could spend a whole lot of time on each of these, and we will be spending a lot more time on the first and the second one, but particularly the first. But as I said, you need to kind of know how different it is. And the only way to do that is to make these contrasts. So let's think about ancient or traditional virtue. I added traditional there because there are still peoples in the world today who more or less share this old notion of virtue and practice it in a similar way. It's traditional. The assumption, first of all, of people who fit this mode of thinking, the assumption is that people are social by nature and that the state is the highest level of our social nature, or the tribe, or whatever the collective body is. So human beings are social by nature, meaning that they cannot really flourish and fully enjoy their lives or be fully effective as their individual selves without the social context backing them up, supporting them, giving them meaning, and so forth. And then the state or tribe or collective body is that highest form of the social, which helps shape them and give them the rules by which they will live, give them the patterns that they will follow. So social norms in a society like this define the ideal person or persons. that everybody kind of strives to be, right? They're ideal persons. And in the ancient context, this meant the hero, in particular, the hero, the manly hero, the adventurer, the ruler, the magnanimous person. And also in some societies like democratic Athens, or Republican Rome, also the good citizen. The laws in such a society, or the rules, aim at making that type of person. So hopefully you're getting a picture of a cohesive society where most people, if not all people, are kind of encouraged to think the same way, to live out their lives in patterns that have been set before them, that maybe generations and generations have followed. They know what the human ideal is. They're striving for it. They're sort of ranking people according to how close or how far they are behaving from that ideal. And the happiest life in a society like this is to be known by everybody as achieving that ideal type. The closer that a person gets to that ideal type, the more they're admired by the rest of society, which just reinforces the desire and the striving to get there. So in ancient Greece and Rome, this could be the warrior, for instance, the heroic warrior figure, the adventurer, sometimes the very wise man, also like, or woman to a certain extent, like Plato and Aristotle, who were able to display their wisdom. Could be the wealthy person, but we'll talk more about that, because not just any wealthy person, they had to sort of display good character. All right, so the notable characteristics of what we would call ancient virtue are that it's, first of all, tribal or social and not individualistic. That's a contrast. We, modern people, are very individualistic. We tend to think in terms of how we contrast with other people, or how we sort of step outside of the herd, so to speak, and are able to live our authentic individual lives. That was not the ideal, right? Rather, people thought in these social terms and wanted to kind of fit in or to exemplify the values of their group. They were therefore shaped by tradition, which the traditions were specific to a people, of course, but often seen as natural. So for instance, when Aristotle talks about magnanimity, okay, and he talks about the magnanimous man who's wealthy and able to use his wealth to be extremely generous to everybody around him and host great events and so on, and to be generous with his time. That was a type of person that was specific to his time period, because there was such wealth built up on the backs of other people's labor that some men could live that way. But Aristotle treats that magnanimous man as if it's a natural and universal kind of category. Why? Because he's an ancient Athenian and he thinks that Athens is the center of the universe and that nothing else could measure up. So of course he would, right? So there's that odd situation where the people within the tradition will see their tradition as kind of absolute. But in hindsight, looking at it from the outside, for instance, looking back at ancient Athens, you realize, oh no, that was specific to their time and place, definitely, and things have changed. It is also socially and spiritually enforced, meaning that society and religion enforce these norms externally, right? So very strongly, right, through social expectations, through what the religions teach people. People would be hard pressed to try to rebel against this because of the very strong external motivation supplied by society. So the function of that is to kind of keep order and to maintain the tradition. Okay, so the ancient character For instance, the sort of one of the ideal characters, probably the ideal character of the ancient world, was the hero, like Odysseus here. Although he really should be strapped to the mast of a ship, but I'm pretty sure this is still Odysseus fighting his way past the sirens, right? Now, he could have stayed where he was and enjoyed his wealth and his family, but Odysseus went off on his adventures and he wanted to prove himself in war, and he ends up getting lost, and then he's got to bravely, fight his way back through all these different like challenges and so on. And he kind of represents the ideal man in ancient Greek society. An ideal hero would never think in terms of narrow self-interest, wouldn't think in terms of money. That's a big contrast. The ancient virtuous person was somebody who would see money as maybe a necessity and something to amass, but only to kind of to display one's generosity and to give away and to more or less be admired by others, but not just to kind of pile up for its own sake. So somebody who would seek wealth and enjoy wealth for its own sake was seen as small and petty in the ancient world, whereas greatness and magnanimity were the proper uses for wealth. So, as far as the pros and cons of ancient virtue, and Aristotle fits in this category, the pros are, first of all, that it aims at something higher than our basic instincts. Ancient virtue aims at something much higher than our basic instincts, something like personal greatness. And personal greatness is tied to societal greatness. I'll give you an example. In Thucydides, the ancient historian, in his history of the Peloponnesian War, which was the war between Athens and Sparta, we have the scene of the Athenian leader Pericles at the beginning, near the beginning of the war, trying to encourage the families of the fallen. Quite a few soldiers had died in a great battle, and he had to give a funeral oration. And what he said seems mighty cold to us. He said, basically, families, have more children. Take heart. Your sons have died a glorious death. Why have they died a glorious death? Not because of their own bravery or their worth as individuals, but because they sacrificed all for the great state of Athens, and Athens' glory is theirs, right? And now go off and have more children so that you can attain more fame and glory for Athens. That, when people read that today, they think, oh my gosh, like that is so cold, right? But it displays ancient virtue in a nutshell. Societal greatness was what all we're supposed to be aiming at. So that's a pro. I put it in the pro category because it inspired people to be better than their basic instincts would make them, would have them be, right? So their lives, to the extent that they strove for those ancient virtues, were more interesting and greater and more of an adventure than if they had just stayed at home with their McDonald's and their video games or whatever. And another pro, I would say, is that in this system, people did not have to examine their internal lives endlessly, because society was framing how people should be. And it really, when you're born into a society like that, you don't really think, oh, like, how do I, what do I think, apart from what you have, been taught. So, whereas today's people tend to, at least some of them, I think, maybe nerdy, neurotic people like myself, are always, examining their internal life, like, am I living up to my potential? Am I expressing myself appropriately? Am I authentic? Am I doing some good in the world? No, that type of soul searching and kind of confusion and constant state of some anxiety, there would be a lot less of that in a society like that. And I count that as a plus.